Good morning. So welcome to semester 1 and welcome to Philosophy of Mind. I really hope you enjoy this unit. You're going to be covering a lot of ground in this semester, so you're going to be looking at different ways of solving the mind-body problem, different alternative ways of even just saying what kind of a problem that is. And the solutions to that problem are going to be coming from really different periods in philosophy as well. So it's a challenging unit, but it's also a good one, and I think you'll hope you'll come away inspired from this in numerous ways. I'll just be taking this first lecture. My name is Jenny Vint. After today, Oshin Deary will be taking the lectures. I'm just filling in for him because he wasn't able to be here today. Is sound okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay, and also sorry for the small screen. That's just apparently the room. So what we're going to do today is two different things. So I'll talk you through some of the admin details, so just kind of basic requirements for this unit and so on. And I'll also then go more into the topic and just give you some different ways of even saying what kind of a problem the mind-body problem that is going to be the topic throughout the semester actually is. So just kind of different ways of framing it, and also different ways of thinking about the relationship between philosophy and neuroscience. But before we do that, so before we go into the admin stuff, I want to give you show you this really brief video.
Just as explorers have always sought to map new worlds, neuroscientists have sought to map the brain, trying to chronicle its connections and deduce how it works. But making a brain map is easier said than done. You can pick a particular property of the brain to base your map on, like its structure, or its connections, or cell types. Here's one early attempt, published in 1909 by Corbini and Brodmann. He noted how the cells look different from one parcel of brain to the next, and his maps are still used today. But depending on the property you look at, your maps can end up quite different. So neuroscientists can't even agree on how many areas there are, let alone what they all do. But now a team has made what could be the most accurate map yet. It's based on hundreds of brains and lots of different properties of those brains. It's even defined a whole bunch of new brain areas. Like this one, Area 55B, which the team thinks has a role in language. It's pretty obvious here in a map of language-related brain activity. And again here, when they look at the connections between this area and others. Not so clear here, though, on a map of how much insulation there is around neurons. That's why combining all these data sources is so important. It might even mean neuroscientists can finally figure out what the brain's borders and territories really look like. Explore the new map and plug in your own brain data at humanconnectome.org.
Okay, so I think there are several things to take from this at the very beginning. So firstly, it's really impressive, or at least I continue to be really impressed by the rapid advances in neuroscience. And you can really get the sense that with all of this stuff happening, that's where the mind-body problem is going to get solved, right? With new technologies, maybe new ways of carving up and mapping the brain and identifying brain function. So a lot is happening there, and it's happening so quickly that it's almost impossible to follow that progress. But secondly, if you look in more detail, it also seems that there's a lot of controversy on a really basic level, right? It's not even clear among neuroscientists what are the relevant regions that should be distinguished in the brain. So how should we distinguish them? What methods should we use precisely? How exactly do we draw those borders between different regions and areas? And then how do we map them on to functions? So those are still very much open questions, and this is still very much work in progress, even alone in neuroscience, okay? Another thing is that if you listened carefully, or if you watched it again with that in mind, the terms like mental states and consciousness and subjectivity and mind weren't even mentioned in this, right? So this is pure neuroscience. This is purely about carving up and mapping brain areas and mapping them to cognitive functions. But how all of that relates to the area that we're interested in here, the mind and mental states, isn't even yet part of that picture. So that's a complete additional step that has to be taken. A last thing that I want to point out, as cool and impressive as all of this is, I think, and I am genuinely impressed by this, this is not like Google Earth, right? This is really not on the level of houses, it's not on the level of streets, and probably not even on the level of suburbs. This is more like continents and countries and maybe big cities, right? So it's still fairly coarse-grained and thereby still fairly far away from where we'll actually have to get. I like this nonetheless because this idea of mapping is going to be one that kind of accompanies us throughout the lecture. So we'll later see how I think and how many people think we can use different types of maps, so brain maps for thinking about brain regions and conceptual maps for thinking about mental states to bring philosophy and neuroscience together. So I think it's a really handy metaphor to keep in mind. So then we'll get started on the topic. This is the funner part, the fun part. Okay. So firstly, as I said before, what we're going to do today is really just think about what kind of a problem, or what kinds of problems the mind-body problem consists in. So we're actually going to see that it's a host of interrelated problems, and there are different ways of framing it. And one thing to see a little bit at the outset is that for most practical purposes, it's not really just a problem about how the mind relates to the body, but it's a problem today, in most cases, about how the mind relates to a particular part of the body, namely the brain, and perhaps even to particular parts of the brain. And you can find this sentiment both in theorizing and in the popular media, and I think this is already something that is kind of influencing how a lot of people in general have come to think about the mind. So a good example is the free will debate, right? Cast in such a way as if the question of whether we have free will is one that is going to be solved in the laboratory by neuroscientists. Okay, so this I think is also a reason why many people think neuroscience is actually threatening and is somehow threatening their image of what it is to be a person, of what it is to be me, and so on and so forth. But you can also see it in these kinds of, I put that up more as a joke, right, these kinds of ideas that you can use certain types of cognitive puzzles as ways to train your brain, right, or certain meditation techniques as ways to train attention, or certain kind of as if your brain were a muscle that you could give a workout, right, and something like, I don't know, like a sports membership or something like that. So basically in doing certain cognitive tasks, memory problems and so on, you're training your brain and thereby training yourself, and then that kind of sits with this, what back in '95 Francis Crick formulated as an astonishing hypothesis: you're nothing but your brain, you're nothing but a pack of neurons in a certain part of your brain. So this is not really news. It's been taken a bit too far in the popular media. It's vaguely threatening, and I think it's also poorly understood. So that's kind of the main message here. But it's also an attractive idea. So at the outset, why would we think that you, or be tempted to say that you or me are nothing but a part of our brains? How do you come up with that idea? Well, one thing to say is that, well, actually, not just my mind, but my body, in the sense of what I experience as my body, my lived body, my subjective body. That's not a physical thing in the world. That's also something, a representation constructed by my brain. That's a certain kind of illusion. It's a kind of hallucination, some people would say. I'm hallucinating my physical body. I'm not in direct contact with it. Why would one want to say that? So here's an example of phantom limb experiences. And these are real ghosts. So phantom limbs, if you haven't heard of them yet, are experiences that can occur in people that have lost a limb. For instance, after an amputation or after an accident, people suddenly lose a limb, for instance an arm, and then have the vivid experience that that arm, even though they know it's no longer there, they're not delusional, okay? But these people nonetheless have the experience that that limb is still present. They can still feel their arm that is no longer physically there. And they often, and this is why it's a problem, don't just have the feeling that the arm is still there, but often they will also experience pain, or the arm will be frozen in an uncomfortable position and they can't move it. And there is real suffering that results from this experience, raising the question of how do you help treat a phantom arm, right? How do you help treat a problem in a limb that isn't physically present? What do you do with that? Now this example that you see here, the lady at the bottom was called Semp, is particularly fascinating because Semp was born without lower limbs, so without arms and legs, and instead she had stumps. So her physical body was what you see there in the white outline. That was her physical body. But her experienced body was complete, right? So she had actually what you see in the gray, those are her phantoms. So she had very vivid phantoms in her arms and in her legs, even though she had never had physical arms and legs in her entire life. And she had these phantoms from early childhood. What you can see there in the numbers are vividness ratings for her phantoms that she would give, and she would do this over many different experimental sessions, so it wasn't a one-off thing. So you can see that there's kind of a landscape of vividness or intensity that her body parts, her phantom body parts seem to have. It's kind of interesting to reflect in the background how vividly you experience your own body. Is that similar or different? And you might think, well, you know, especially in a person born without lower limbs, it might just be wishful thinking. You know, of course she would have seen people with complete bodies. Of course, especially as a child, she would have longed to have that kind of a body, and maybe that led her to just say that this is what I experience as my body, but maybe this somehow wasn't a robust phenomenon. And indeed, when she was little, people said that to her, you know, stop talking about your arms and your legs, you don't have any, you're just imagining this. So she actually stopped talking about that for quite a long time until she learned more about phantom limbs being a real phenomenon. Now, there are good arguments for saying that she was in fact not imagining things, right? That this was in fact an experience that was rooted in basically brain maps of her body, of her absent limbs, that were nonetheless active and led her to have that kind of experience. So here you see Peter Brugger, a Swiss researcher working in Zurich who did a lot of work with Semp and has done a lot of work with people with phantom limb experiences. And what you see there is basically an image of her brain that shows that those parts of her brain are put differently. When she said she was moving her phantom fingers, yeah, there was activity in exactly those parts of the brain that you would also expect to light up if I were moving my fingers, right? So basically her brain was responding to phantom movement in the same way as your brain would respond to actual physical and thereby also experienced movement. So I think this is a strong argument, and there were many others, for saying that, well, she actually had this experience of a body that was not present. Her body, her experienced body, was actually in her brain. What you can see here then is that you can use that type of research to actually establish a mapping of the experienced body to parts of the sensory motor cortex. So what you see there at the bottom is often called the Penfield Homunculus. Now you'll hear a bit about homunculi in the plural throughout the semester. So a homunculus is a little person in the head. And typically it's the kind of thing that you do not want in your theory of mind, right? So that's normally a way to shoot down theoretical claims about the mind, to say that they're homuncular, because they've introduced a little person, a little observer sitting in the head, watching, for instance, visual experience on a little private cinema projected onto a screen somewhere in the head. No such thing exists, and if you have that in your theory, you've just pushed the problem of consciousness one step back. So typically this is not something you want to have. However, the Penfield Homunculus is a different kind of homunculus, right? That's actually a point about saying there is something, and this is based on good neuroscience evidence, there is something like a map of body parts in the brain, and that's what we call the Penfield Homunculus. What you can see there, so the parts of the brain that are concerned with sensing and moving the body, what you can see there is that different body parts are represented in the brain, but they don't have quite the same size or quite the same arrangement as they do in your actual physical body. Some areas are really big, for instance the face or the hand, while others are fairly small. And it's kind of interesting to think about how the relative size of different body parts on those brain maps represents the degree of specialization that you have in those actual limbs, right? Faces, facial gestures, and hands. That's something that we need very detailed maps of, because we actually use them for very fine-grained movements. You can then also consider how that might be for other creatures. So what other creatures have specially dedicated and highly specialized body parts, and how big might those representations be? And you can think about how the relative size of those representations links up to the way you experience your body. Like, I would hypothesize that, in fact, when you think about your experienced body, it isn't perfectly in proportion like this, but actually aspects like the hand or the face actually take a more prominent position in your experiential landscape as well. Maybe a last note on this: how does the body map in the brain actually map on much more closely to your experienced body than this physical thing out there? Is some work from Ramachandran, so again, pioneer in working on these types of phantom limbs, bodily experience, and how it can change in relation to the physical body. And what you see here on the lower right-hand side is a patient who had lost his arm following, not sure if it was amputation or accident or what had happened there, but again said he had vivid phantom limbs. The phantom arm, I believe, wasn't quite representative of the real arm, but often patients will then say, for instance, it's shorter. They can feel their fingers up here where their upper arm would be, or something like that. Sometimes limbs, phantom limbs, also change over time, for instance, in size. And what they found here, you can see these traces on the cheek, was that this person, this man would actually say, when you stimulated him on the cheek, for instance, using a cotton swab, or just touched him, he would say, this is really weird. I can feel the touches on my cheek in my phantom fingers. So there was almost a correspondence between stimulating a part of the face and the phantoms, right? The phantom fingers. And the reason for this, Ramachandran has proposed, and this brings us back to the body map in the brain, is that, as you can see here, the hand and the face area are actually adjacent. They're next to each other. Right? So if remapping occurs following the loss of the brain, For instance, the face area is slowly going to take over the area that was previously dedicated to the hand, and the physical hand is no longer present. So you're going to slowly find that face area taking over that former area, and you're going to find, as you would predict, that kind of merging between tactile stimulation on the face and the phantom fingers. So I think that's a really tempting, it's a fascinating field, I think, but it's also a tempting reason for saying that, yeah, even your body is in the brain. But that's not all of the problem. This is only part of the issue. So we're going to push this a bit further and see what that actually means for the mind-body problem. So from what I've been saying so far, so this is from the required readings, and I'll go through this quite quickly because there are other points I want to make, is that you might think that most of the mind-body problem is in fact one that can be handed over to the so-called hard sciences, so to physics, to neuroscience, to neurobiology, neurochemistry, and so on and so forth. And you might think that really progress will be made, and many people think this, when we no longer say that we're studying perhaps the mind at all. The mind seems to be some squishy, imprecise thing. And a lot of the methods that are used to study mental states, so this is what Chris Frith calls the soft sciences, for instance, psychology, but also philosophy would be an example, or anthropology. And these so-called soft sciences are actually using types of data and types of evidence that are not quite, it seems to many people, objective, right? Things like subjective reports, maybe questionnaires, or even just free descriptions of what you're currently experiencing. Those don't seem to be the kind of things that can be reliably reproduced in laboratories and so on. So I think a lot of people have this feeling, and continue to have this feeling, that real progress will be made once these kind of imprecise types of disciplines can actually be integrated into neuroscience, right? What we need is more precise measurements, better methods, and they can then slowly integrate what was previously psychology, and we'll just get rid of those messy subjective first-person data. So that's something that you will still sometimes hear in research circles. I think you're probably getting a sense of this by now. I think that that would be an extremely problematic approach, and if that were where the story ended, we would actually be missing almost everything that we're interested in, right? So even if you think about the stuff that I was showing you earlier about phantom limbs, if there weren't first reliance on and systematic methods to probe subjective experience, for instance, in people like Ayhat Semp, there would be no way to actually identify the correlating neural activity in the first place, right? It would just be half of the story. And I think what we rather need is actually improved and fine-grained and disciplined methods to study mental states and subjective experience and bring them together with neuroscience so we can actually end up with getting both parts of the picture. So both sides are needed, both the side of philosophy and the side of subjective experience and conceptualizing mental states, and the side of neuroscience, to form a complete, anything like a complete, or hopes of a complete picture of the mind. So the thing to consider here to make this a bit more compelling is that even if we wanted to say, and again, these are just two conflicting intuitions that many people have, even if we wanted to say, well, maybe it's a matter of empirical discovery, whether the mind just is the brain, or whether the self, whether I am just nothing other than a certain pattern of brain activity in a certain region of the brain. Even if that were something that you could discover in the lab, and I'm not convinced that that is actually something that we can make sense of, we might still fail to understand why that is the case. And what we want to do from the outset, it seems, is to understand how our minds, how mental states, emotions and beliefs, and self-consciousness and all of that, how it can be the case that they are actually related to physical activity of a certain sort, to certain types of brain processes. And as long as we haven't fully grasped how that could be the case, getting any statement of the type, well, mind just is identical to brain, isn't going to give us what we wanted. That's not what we wanted to know. It's not just a brute fact. We want to really grasp what that relationship is like. So we need, alone for that reason, something more. So kind of what we're working towards then, in my view at least, is really an interdisciplinary endeavor of bringing together kind of old-fashioned conceptual work and theorizing about the mind with new methods, and then using those to develop new kinds of experimental research. Okay, so that brings us to different ways of formulating what the mind-body problem really is and how we can carve that up. So as I said in the beginning, it's really a host of interrelated problems, and it comes in different shades and flavors, and I just want to give you some of the main ones. And the first one is something that's often called the semantic problem. Not to worry about technical terms so much, but all that really means is, what do we mean when we say, in talking about the mind-body problem, what is it that we're actually talking about? What do we actually mean by terms such as the body and the mind, or mental states, or self? How can we define those more precisely? Now, you might think this is mostly a problem for the mind and mental states and self, because those seem to be very vague concepts, and it's not at all easy to define them clearly. But we've even seen that this is a problem in thinking about the body, right? And the distinction that we had with phantom limbs between the experienced subjective body and the physical thing out there. Even there can be some kind of distinction, right? So this comes back to the thing I said at the beginning with the video about mapping. What we want then, I think, is a taxonomy and something like a conceptual map of different kinds of mental states and how they relate to each other, roughly what you see on the right-hand side. And if we had that kind of a conceptual map, so say, how does self relate to conscious experience? Does everything that has conscious experience, whatever that is, have a self? Do you develop a self over time? What about the relationship between beliefs and bodily sensations? And what about the relationship between beliefs and wishes and emotions and so on and so forth, right? So all of these are things that a conceptual map of the mind is going to have to clarify. How does consciousness change from healthy standard wakefulness that you have right now to states where you fall asleep and where you drift off into dreams, or maybe lose consciousness in dreamless deep sleep and then reboot when you wake up? So what happens to conscious experience across those different changes? What happens in disorders? Those are questions, I think, for a conceptual map of different kinds of mental states, and I think that can also be usefully informed by empirical research. Once we have that, we can then also have the type of mapping exercise I showed you at the beginning. How do we carve up different areas of the brain dedicated to language, to seeing, to hearing, and so on and so forth, to emotions? Once we have that, how does brain activity change, again, in disorders, but also over sleep-wake states, and so on and so forth? And how can those two maps be brought together? And I think an important thing here is that the grain of both types of maps is going to have to be similar. But again, to make progress, and this is why there's a strong semantic element to the mind-body problem, we have to be really clear on what we actually mean by the types of mental states that we're trying to identify or map onto the brain. So really coarse-grained map of mental states, and this will be coming back throughout the semester, is something like this, a really basic distinction that you'll find in a lot of the readings. And again, you'll spend actually separate weeks talking about, for instance, beliefs is a whole separate topic of research that could fill a whole semester versus what we have there at the bottom in terms of subjective or phenomenal experience. So kind of a coarse-grained way of carving up mental states in philosophy is that distinction between so-called intentional or content-bearing states on the one hand and phenomenal states on the other hand. So examples of content-bearing or intentional states are things like beliefs, thoughts, and desires, and wishes, and wonderings, and doubts. And they have content, and they can be expressed in the form of propositions, right? So there you have a brain in a vat, perhaps believing erroneously that they're walking outside in the sun, right? So you can have a certain content, I'm walking outside in the sun, and you can believe it, or you can wish that it were the case, or you can wonder whether it is the case. Am I now walking outside in the sun? Or am I just dreaming, or am I just a brain in a vat, and so on and so forth. But the interesting thing about all of these cases is that these kinds of mental states that have content seem to point to something other than themselves. They seem to point outside of the skull to something in the world. And now we have states that seem to represent something. They can be either true or false, right? If I believe that I'm now walking outside in the sun, that belief is false. If I wish I were, that belief can be fulfilled. It has fulfillment conditions. So now we get a lot of the things that philosophers are interested in terms of truth and falsity and knowledge and so on and so forth. Things that refer. And it's really a question how any physical thing, but specifically how a squishy gray physical thing, so the brain, gets to have contents and beliefs about things in the world that it is never in direct contact with. And you'll see some possible ways of solving that problem later on in the next couple of weeks. Now the other side, the lower side, is something that also many people today still continue to think is something like the mystery, the unsolvable mystery about conscious experience isn't just that it has content, but that it feels like something. So Thomas Nagel, whom you'll also talk about a bit in later weeks, has this formulation, well, phenomenal states are states that it's something like to be in for the person who has them. In some sense, you're conscious if there's something that it's like to be you at this moment, right? There's something it's like to have chocolate ice cream, and that is somehow distinctively different from having vanilla ice cream. And it's really, really different from having a pain experience. And there's something distinctively icky about pain and the kind of subjective fear that colors it. But what is that, right? It's not just a behavioral reaction. There's something experiential about that, right? Or what about seeing a sunset, or that specific squishy feeling that you get in your belly when you see a person you love, and all of that, right? That whole landscape of subjective experience seems really mystifying. So one question is, how does a physical process get to feel like anything in the first place? How can we grasp that some physical processes in the brain, if we believe that, have that subjective quality to them that really seems to make up almost everything we care about in our mental lives? And why does one thing feel specifically that way and not some other way? Why does pain feel the way it does? And why does chocolate taste exactly that way and not differently? How does that happen? That's pretty much a mystery. So many people think that those two problems, how do you get content into the mind, and how do you explain subjective feels and qualitative experience, however you want to put that. Those are the two main challenges many people think for understanding the mind, and many people think that no amount of neuroscience information can ever get us there. So that's just kind of to show you one basic way of carving up mental states, a really coarse-grained conceptual map that should already give you a sense of the problem. What you can do then, in principle, and again this is coming back to things we've said earlier, is of course once you've identified through appropriate conceptual mapping, if we want to call it that, a kind of conscious experience or a kind of mental state that you want to identify. For instance, say a visual experience of a German Shepherd. That's your goal. You want to understand what's happening in the brain when that specific type of experience occurs. And you can now say, well, okay, that can be the case for German Shepherd experiences in seeing, when you're actually seeing one. But it could also be the case for dreaming up one or hallucinating one. And then you want to know, well, what is going to be the neural activity associated with that type of experience? And you can do that. So that's, again, something that you'll see coming back or may have heard of as well. That's kind of the quest for the neural correlates of consciousness. What are the neural correlates of specific contents of consciousness? And a lot of the work that's out there is of this type, right? Saying this type of neural activity correlates reliably with that type of mental state or even that type of experience. And again, this is pretty fascinating, but if you've ever done for instance, ever done a class in critical thinking, you know that correlation explains absolutely nothing, right? So correlation is interesting, but that just means you have one event here and another event there, and they happen at the same time. Whether one causes the other, or how they relate to each other, or whether there's a third cause, explaining that correlation is left completely open. That just means co-occurrence and nothing more. So as interesting that as that is, again, something more is needed to make true progress towards understanding. And that brings us to the next version of the mind-body problem, or the next flavor of the mind-body problem. That's now not just a semantic problem about saying what do we mean when we talk about mental states, but how can we understand the relationship between mind and body and move beyond correlation to actual understanding and not just brute statement of fact. And what would actually count as a satisfying explanation of consciousness? When would we actually have understood that, yeah, now I get why that brain feels the way it does right now? I mean, at the point that we're at right now, we can't even reliably say that brain is now conscious versus unconscious, right? So we're a far cry away from that. But maybe someday that would be the hope, we can get an understanding of, yeah, this is the brain activity I see now, so of course that's what it feels like. This is the type of explanation or the type of progress we would need. And some people, so here you have the explanatory gap. Joe Levine think that will never be possible. Some people think there's a principled gap that will always prevent us from truly understanding why a certain type of brain activity, a certain type of physical process is related to mental states in a certain way. Unclear whether we can ever bridge that gap. Related to the epistemological problem, so how can we come to know what the relation between brain states and mental states is like? How can we come to understand it? Is a methodological problem. Which methods are best for investigating mental states and their relation to the brain? And that ranges from questions about, you know, do you use EEG, or do you use neuroimaging, or do you tamper with the brain? To questions of how you gather experience reports. Do you just let people talk, or do you ask people questions, or do you just ignore what they're saying at all? And how do you bring those different things together? So there are real methodological questions to ask as well, also about what kinds of disciplines get to be part of this project. And all of that kind of comes together to then form, to potentially form our new science, science of the mind and science of consciousness. This was not actually required reading, but required watching. So if you watch this, or if not, you can go back. There's a short, I think 10-minute section, short 10-minute video where David Chalmers explains what he takes to be the hard problem of consciousness. And that's exactly what I was just saying. So he has this distinction between a number of questions just about neural functioning or cognitive mechanisms that you can easily answer in neuroscience alone. But to him, the hard problem is just that. How could it ever be the case that any physical process, no matter how complex it is and no matter how well you can depict it, maybe even using, you could imagine 3D neuroimaging, or maybe you could have a virtual simulation of an active living brain and you can walk into it and look around it, but it would still just be physical information. And how could we ever get from that type of information to subjective experience and understanding what it's like to be in that state for that person, or why it had to be like anything? So that's the hard problem of consciousness. Why does any kind of physical activity give rise to subjective experience rather than to nothing at all? And that seems to be, that's a basic question, and even that seems to be deeply mystifying. And really, many people to this day think that problem, as formulated by David Chalmers, is one of the guiding and central problems that we're still grappling with today. And then finally, there's something that you might call the metaphysical problem, the metaphysical reading of the mind-body problem. And I want to spend just the last few minutes talking about that. And that asks, firstly, about what kinds of things we're really talking about here. So is the mind a thing? Next week, you'll be looking at Descartes and dualism, in which the idea is that the mind is a kind of entity that exists in a similar way, though in a slightly different realm from the body. But that could be wrong. The mind could be a process. The mind could be, mental states could be dispositions to behave in certain ways, and so on. So there's even controversy as to what type of category the mind or mental states are supposed to belong into. There are then questions about how minds and bodies physically interact. How does it happen when you decide to move your arm that you do move your arm, or when somebody pricks your finger that it actually hurts? How does that interaction work in both directions? A nice way to carve up that problem, now there are other standard ways, but I really like this one. So this is Swiss philosopher and author Peter Biri, writes wonderful novels under the pen name Pascal Mercier, so that's just one reading recommendation for the day. And he has this really nifty way of carving that up, and that's called the Biri trilemma, that consists of these three statements. So mental phenomena are non-physical phenomena. Firstly, it's not the same as just physics. It's not any part of the body or the brain that we can identify with mental phenomena. Secondly, we want to say that they have causal effects in the physical world. Like I was just saying, if you decide to do something, that's a mental state, and that seems to bring about changes in the physical world. And thirdly, the physical domain is causally closed. There's no fairy stuff. All real causes out there are physical causes. There's no non-physical stuff that causally intervenes, for instance, on the body. Now, why is it a trilemma? Well, all three of those statements seem to have a high degree of plausibility. Many people want to say, at least initially, that all of them are true. But if you think through it, not all of them can be true. At most, two of them can be true. And so that means that one of them has to go. And a really central problem that you can use, and that you'll be using throughout the semester, to categorize different types of solutions to the mind-body problem, is figuring out who is willing to give up which one of those. And there are different ways of answering that. I was going to go through that with you now, but we're running out of time, so it might be fun at home or even in tutorials to consider which one of those you would be willing to give up, and also to think more about why you can't have all three at the same time. Brief spoiler message before I end. So where do we end? How do we solve the mind-body problem in the semester? What's the correct answer? We don't, right? So one thing that you can't expect and shouldn't expect at this point is a final solution to this issue. This is a live problem, and people are still thinking about it and having debates about it. And that can seem frustrating in a way because there's no correct or incorrect answer, no correct or incorrect solution, but it also means that exactly different types of arguments and new types of thinking about it are needed, and progress here is still possible. This is something that is still happening, and I think that makes it actually interesting and exciting and fun to work on, and carves out space for yourselves to think about it as well. I also think, and this is again just further food for thought, that getting this problem right really, really matters beyond the classroom and beyond academia. This was the piece by Anil Seth, again, just a Guardian piece. This matters for many different areas. It matters beginning with how can we even detect when consciousness is gone in vegetative state patients, for example. How can we even detect that? People can't right now. How presumed states of coma, deep anesthesia, where you really think and want to believe those are states where consciousness is lost. Research is coming out saying that things are not that simple, right? Similar things on dreamless deep sleep. Is it even clear that we lose it completely in dreamless deep sleep? Not necessarily. And I think there are also real questions, not just about human consciousness, but also about how we treat other creatures that may or might not have it. So I think those are just some reasons for really wanting to get it right. Two final book recommendations, recent ones, up in the slides if you want to have a look. And if you want some more food for thought on this. And with that, I'll leave you and hope you enjoy the rest of the semester and your tutorials, and that you have fun thinking about this. Thanks.